The courthouse was supposed to be a place of order, justice, and respect for the law, but on that morning it felt more like a stage set for humiliation. The rows of oak benches were filled with people waiting for their names to be called. Mothers clutched their children, lawyers shuffled papers, and a few journalists tapped on their phones, already sniffing a story before one had even broken. At the center of all this, a black woman in her mid-30s walked in quietly, head held high, a folder clutched to her chest. Her name was Mariah Daniels, and although no one in that room knew it yet, her presence would change the course of that day and many lives forever. She wasn't dressed like the average defendant, who usually appeared in this court. Her tailored navy blue blazer fit neatly over a crisp white blouse, and her slacks had been ironed to perfection. She looked like someone who had prepared for an important meeting, not like someone dragged into court on short notice. Yet the bailiff glanced at her with suspicion, as though her very confidence was out of place. Mariah calmly found a seat in the second row, placed her folder on her lap, and scanned the room. She was there for a hearing, but not for herself. She had come in defense of her younger brother, a college student wrongfully accused of theft, after a run-in with an off-duty officer at a convenience store. The air was thick with impatience. A white officer leaned against the wall, his hand resting casually on his holster, scanning the room like everyone inside was guilty until proven innocent. When Mariah caught his stare, she refused to look away. For a long second, they locked eyes, and the contempt in his expression hardened into something colder. She broke the tension by looking forward again, but that one silent exchange planted the seed for what was about to unfold. When the clerk called her brother's name, Mariah rose with him. The young man's shoulders slumped, but she placed a reassuring hand on his back, whispering, "Stand tall. Don't let them see fear." He nodded, trying to absorb some of her strength. Together, they walked toward the front, where the judge had not yet arrived. As they waited, the officer who had been staring earlier moved closer, clearly irritated by her composure. His boots echoed on the polished floor as he stepped behind, them muttering something under his breath. Mariah didn't respond, but when he deliberately brushed against her, almost knocking her off balance, she turned her head sharply and said, "Excuse me?" The officer's jaw clenched. "Watch your tone," he hissed. The courtroom grew uneasy. A few people glanced up from their paperwork. The sound of shuffling feet filled the silence as tension thickened. Mariah held her ground. "I will watch my tone when you watch your hands," she replied evenly, not raising her voice but making sure her words carried. That was all it took. In an instant, his palm lashed across her face. The sharp crack echoed through the room, startling everyone. Gasps erupted from the benches. A child started crying. Mariah staggered but did not fall. She stood frozen, one hand pressed to her cheek, her eyes blazing with a mix of shock and fury. The officer, realizing what he had just done in front of a full courtroom, straightened up, trying to mask his panic with authority. "She was being aggressive," he barked, as though saying it out loud could rewrite the truth everyone had witnessed. The bailiff looked uncertain. The clerk's mouth hung open. A few people had their phones out, recording in disbelief. The murmurs spread like fire. Did that just happen? Did he just slap her? But Mariah didn't crumble. She didn't cry. Instead, she slowly lowered her hand from her face, her voice steady as steel when she said, "Is this how justice is delivered here?" With a slap instead of evidence. The room fell silent again. All eyes were on her. The officer tried to interject, but before he could, the heavy side door creaked open and the judge walked in, robes swaying with each step. Judge Whitaker, a man in his 60s with a reputation for being short-tempered, took his seat at the bench, immediately sensing the unusual tension in the room. "What is going on here?" he demanded, his gavel striking once, the sound booming like thunder. Nobody answered at first. The officer looked smug, convinced the judge would take his side. But Mariah turned to face the bench and spoke clearly. Your Honor, before these proceedings even began, I was assaulted by an officer of this court. Gasps filled the room again. Judge Whitaker narrowed his eyes. Assaulted? By whom? Mariah pointed directly at the officer, her voice unwavering. By him. The officer scoffed. She's lying. She. But before he could finish, a voice from the benches called out, I saw it. He hit her. Another person shouted, I got it on video. Several others raised their hands, nodding, confirming the truth. The judge's gavel slammed. Again. Order. Order in the court. Mariah stood tall, refusing to be silenced. And in that moment, though no one realized it yet, the balance of power in the room had shifted. Because Mariah Daniels was not just her brother's sister. She was not just a woman defending her family. She was a trained attorney. And what none of them knew, what the officer who slapped her would soon regret more than anything, was that she had been appointed as a new judge for that very courthouse. Her confirmation finalized only days earlier. The officer had not just struck a woman. He had struck the very person who, in a matter of moments, would be sitting in the judge's chair. The judge's eyes darted between Mariah, the officer, and the restless crowd of witnesses who were now whispering loudly among themselves. He hadn't even had a chance to bang the gavel twice before the entire atmosphere had turned hostile and unpredictable. Judge Whitaker, known for his stern grip over his courtroom, suddenly realized he was sitting on top of a powder keg ready to explode. Silence, he barked, raising his voice higher than usual. The murmurs settled into uneasy quiet, but the energy of the room still pulsed with outrage. He leaned forward, peering over his glasses at Mariah. You're telling this court that you were assaulted, right here, in my courtroom, before I entered? Yes, Your Honor, Mariah said firmly, keeping her voice steady, not betraying even a tremor of fear. This officer, unprovoked, struck me in front of everyone. You have witnesses. You have video evidence. This court is supposed to stand for justice, so let's see if it does. The officer shifted uncomfortably, but tried to force confidence into his posture. She's exaggerating, Your Honor. She got in my face, raised her voice, and I had to keep the peace. I barely touched. Her barely touched, Mariah repeated, her eyes narrowing. Everyone heard it. Everyone saw it. Someone from the back shouted again, We saw it, Judge. He slapped her hard. Another voice followed, Check the video, Judge. It's all here. Dozens of eyes turned toward the officer, their anger growing. The officer's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to losing control of a narrative. Usually, his badge gave him the power to dictate the story, but not today. Not with so many witnesses. Not with a woman like Mariah, standing unflinching before him. Judge Whitaker frowned, clearly troubled. He didn't like being forced into corners. Bailiff, he ordered, collect any phones with video evidence. I want to see exactly what happened before I make any ruling. The bailiff, who had looked hesitant moments earlier, now had a clear directive. He began moving through the courtroom, collecting phones from those who claimed to have recorded the incident. Every person who handed one over looked at Mariah with a nod of support. The tide of the room was shifting against the officer, and he knew it. Mariah's brother stood beside her, his face tense, his fists clenched at his sides. For the first time since his arrest, he looked less like a defendant and more like someone who believed in the possibility of justice. His sister's courage had sparked something in him. While the bailiff gathered devices, the officer leaned toward the judge. Your Honor, with all due respect, this woman is disruptive. If you let her grandstand like this, it'll turn into a circus. She should be removed until order is restored. The suggestion drew loud groans and protests from the benches. People began speaking over one another. She didn't do anything wrong. He hit her, not the other way around. Why should she be punished for telling the truth? The courtroom was no longer docile, had become a chorus of defiance. Judge Whitaker slammed his gavel again, harder this time. Enough. He glared at the officer. This court will decide what is disruptive and what is not. Do not presume to tell me how to maintain order. For a split second, Mariah caught something in the judge's tone and opening, a shift, a crack in the wall of routine authority. She had spent her career watching men like Whitaker wield power, as though it were their birthright. But she also knew the law better than most people in that room, and now, standing in the heat of this moment, she realized the opportunity it gave her. Your Honor, she said calmly, before this escalates any further, allow me to introduce myself properly. My name is Mariah Daniels. I am an attorney, sworn in this very state, and as of last week, confirmed by the governor's office, I have been appointed to serve as a judge in this courthouse. The words detonated in the air like dynamite. The officer's face went pale. The entire courtroom gasped. The clerk dropped her pen, and it clattered onto the desk. Even Judge Whitaker blinked several times, his usually unshakable demeanor slipping. You, what did you just say? The judge asked, leaning forward in disbelief. I said, Mariah repeated with the clarity of a hammer striking steel, that I am a judge of this court, Your Honor. My confirmation letter was filed only days ago. Today, I came not as a judge, but as counsel for my brother, because justice matters to me, whether I wear the robe or not. And that officer, she turned sharply to point at him again, assaulted a sitting judge in front of dozens of witnesses. The silence after her words was thick, almost unbearable. The officer stumbled back a step, suddenly aware of the enormity of his mistake. The courtroom spectators buzzed like hornets, whispering, gasping, pointing at him. Phones continued recording, capturing every tremor in his expression. Judge Whitaker looked stunned. For years he had sat on that bench, doling out rulings with unquestioned authority. But here was a woman who, by law, was his equal now soon to be wearing robes of her own, and she had just been struck in his courtroom, under his watch. The scandal of it was already beyond his control. The judge rubbed his temple, exhaled heavily, then said, Bailiff, place this officer under immediate suspension pending investigation. Confiscate his badge and weapon. The courtroom erupted in cheers, claps, and gasps of satisfaction. Some shouted, That's right. Finally, some justice. The officer, furious, turned red as he sputtered, This is insane. You can't. But the bailiff, emboldened by the judge's order, moved swiftly, taking the officer's gun and badge. The officer resisted for a moment, but the sound of dozens of people shouting him down silenced his struggle. He was led out of the courtroom, his head low. While every camera phone captured his walk of shame, Mariah stood tall, her cheeks still faintly red from the slap, but her presence radiated strength. She turned back to the judge's bench. Your Honor, she said respectfully but firmly, the law demands accountability, not just for my brother, but for anyone who walks into this courthouse expecting fairness. Judge Whitaker stared at her, a mixture of pride, unease, and grudging respect flickering across his face. Slowly, he stood from his chair. The room went still, watching every move. Then, in a gesture that no one would ever forget, he stepped aside, gesturing toward the bench. Judge Daniels, he said, his voice heavy with gravity, perhaps you should take your rightful seat. And with that, Mariah walked up the steps to the bench, the room holding its breath as the woman who had just been slapped in the face by power itself now claimed the very seat that embodied it. She lowered herself into the chair, her hands resting on the polished wood, her eyes sweeping across the courtroom. The gavel sat before her, waiting. Slowly, deliberately, she picked it up, and with one sharp strike, she declared, Court is now in session. The sound of the gavel struck by Mariah Daniels wasn't just the start of a session. It was the sound of history being rewritten inside those four walls. Everyone in the room knew they were witnessing something they would tell their children about one day. A black woman who had just been slapped by an officer in open court now sat in the judge's chair. Her robe, unseen, but her authority undeniable. For a moment, silence hung over the room. Even the shuffling of papers stopped. Even the restless coughs of those waiting on their hearings were swallowed by awe. Every eye fixed on Mariah, and every phone camera tilted upward to capture the image of her, framed by the towering bench that had so often been occupied by men who looked nothing like her. Mariah let the silence stretch, because she understood power. She knew that sometimes words were unnecessary when presence alone could command attention. She breathed in deeply, her fingers resting on the gavel as though she'd held it 1,000 times already. Finally, she spoke, her voice measured and resolute. This court exists for one reason: to uphold justice. Not to humiliate, not to intimidate, not to abuse. What just happened here is proof of how fragile that promise can be when power is placed in the wrong hands. Her words echoed against the paneled walls, heavy with meaning. No one dared to interrupt. She continued, eyes scanning the crowd, the trembling young defendants, the weary mothers, the indifferent clerks, the journalists who had suddenly realized they were in the middle of the biggest story of their careers. Today, she said, we restore that promise. We remind every person watching that no badge, no uniform, and no seat of authority gives anyone the right to strike another human being out of arrogance or rage, especially not in a house of justice. The officer, now standing at the side with his badge stripped, tried to protest. This is outrageous. She's grandstanding. She can't just. Mariah raised a hand, silencing him instantly. You've had your say. Now the law will have its turn. Sit down, or you'll be removed. The audience erupted into murmurs of approval, some clapping despite the seriousness of the moment. Even Judge Whitaker, who had stepped aside, stood, with his arms crossed, an odd mixture of shame and admiration settling on his face. Mariah straightened in her seat and turned her gaze to the clerk. Please call the next case. Daniels versus State. The clerk, still flustered, stammered, Why yes, Your Honor, before shuffling papers quickly. The case of Jamal Daniels, charged with theft in the 2nd degree. Mariah's brother stepped forward timidly. His wide eyes scanned the benches, then flicked nervously toward his sister now seated above him. It felt surreal to him. She wasn't just his sister anymore. In this moment, she was the law itself. Jamal Daniels, Mariah said, her voice softening slightly, you stand accused of theft. But before we allow this accusation to stain your name, this court will examine the facts, not assumptions, not prejudice. The prosecutor, a young white man in a rumpled suit, cleared his throat. He hadn't expected the shift in authority and wasn't sure how to proceed. Your Honor, the defendant was caught on surveillance entering a convenience store and leaving without paying for merchandise. An off-duty officer, Mariah cut in, her tone sharp. An off-duty officer, the same one who struck me moments ago. The prosecutor faltered. Ah, yes, Your Honor, Officer Grant. The courtroom buzzed again. People shook their heads, realizing how twisted the web of accusations had become. The very officer who had slapped Mariah had also been the sole witness tying her brother to a crime. The foundation of the case cracked beneath its own weight. Proceed, Mariah said, her voice calm but laced with steel. The prosecutor swallowed. The officer claims he saw the defendant conceal an item and walk out without paying. Store management provided security footage, but it's inconclusive. It's not entirely clear whether the item was paid for or not. Mariah leaned forward. So the case rests solely on the testimony of a man now suspended for perjury of conduct and assault against a judge. Ah, the prosecutor stammered, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Yes, Your Honor. Then this case should never have reached this courtroom, Mariah said firmly. She turned to her brother. Jamal Daniels, the charges against you are hereby dismissed with prejudice. You are free to go. and this court apologizes for the wrongful burden placed on you." The sound of applause burst from the benches, uncontrolled, unstoppable. Jamal's shoulders sagged with relief, tears welling in his eyes as he looked up at his sister. She gave him a small nod, just enough to reassure him, before shifting her attention back to the room. "But," Mariah continued, her tone growing sharper again, "this case is not just about my brother. This is about every young man and woman dragged into court on flimsy charges, built on the word of authority figures who believe their badge makes them infallible. Today we saw how quickly lies unravel when exposed to the light. Let this be a warning. Justice is not a toy. It is not a weapon. It is a sacred trust." The journalists' fingers flew across their keyboards. Headlines were already being written in their minds. "Officer slaps black. Woman in court, she becomes the judge. Historic turn in local courtroom as newly appointed black judge takes bench." After assault, Mariah placed the gavel down gently, the sound more symbolic now than procedural. She knew this was bigger than her brother's case. This was about reclaiming the dignity that had been denied to her community, and to countless others who walked into courts expecting fairness and instead found hostility. "Before we move on to the next matter," she said, her gaze cutting like glass across the room, "let the record reflect, no one is above accountability in this court, not even those who wear the uniform, especially not them." She leaned back in the chair, her expression calm, but unyielding. She belonged here, and every person watching knew it. The one-slapped woman was no longer a victim of injustice. She was the one delivering justice, and she had only just begun. The courthouse had never felt so alive. The walls, usually weighed down by routine hearings and muted despair, now seemed to vibrate with energy, as though even the building itself recognized the historic shift taking place within it. Outside the doors, word was spreading like wildfire. The videos recorded just minutes earlier had already been uploaded and shared. Reporters began receiving alerts on their phones. By the time Mariah finished Jamal's case, the world outside those walls was already watching. Inside, Judge Whitaker remained standing at the side, a silent witness to everything. He was a man who had always believed in maintaining control, in running his courtroom like a tight ship. Yet here he was. Outsiders might think he'd lost control, but deep down he knew he was witnessing something that had been a long time coming. He studied Mariah as she handled herself, and though pride was not an emotion he often entertained, he could not deny that she embodied the very integrity the bench demanded. The officer, now seated in shame at the far corner under guard, seethed with resentment. His face was red, his hands fidgeted against the table, his eyes darted about like a man desperate for an escape hatch. But there was none. Every glance from the audience condemned him. Every phone lens trained on him reminded him that his actions had been preserved, forever etched into the record of public shame. Mariah looked out at the courtroom, sensing the crowd's energy. She knew momentum was everything. Moments like these could inspire change, but only if handled with care. She lifted the gavel once more. "This court will now address the matter of misconduct by Officer Grant," she declared. "His actions, both inside this courtroom and prior, have called into question not only his judgment, but also his credibility as a witness." The bailiff straightened. The clerk fumbled with her notes. The spectators leaned forward eagerly. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was accountability unfolding in real time. The officer jumped up. "This isn't legal. You can't just—" Mariah's gaze froze him in place. "Sit down, Officer Grant. This court has jurisdiction to address contempt, misconduct, and perjury. You will be heard, but you will not dictate." The weight of her words silenced him more effectively than any handcuffs could. She turned to the bailiff, read the statement of suspension. The bailiff cleared his throat and, though nervous, followed her command. Effective immediately. Officer Thomas Grant is suspended without pay, pending formal review of misconduct. including allegations of assault, abuse of power, and filing of questionable testimony in multiple cases. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Multiple cases. Suddenly, this wasn't just about Jamal. This was about every case Grant had touched, every young man and woman who had stood accused on the basis of his word alone. The realization hit the audience like a storm. If his credibility fell apart here, how many lives had been damaged before today? Mariah nodded gravely. Let the record show that a review of all past cases involving this officer must be conducted immediately. Justice cannot stand on a foundation of lies. Reporters scribbled furiously. Phones buzzed. The story had grown beyond anyone's imagination. At the back of the courtroom, Jamal stood watching his sister with awe. Only hours earlier, he had believed his life could be ruined by a false charge. Now, he saw the tables turned completely. His sister wasn't just protecting him, she was tearing down a wall of corruption that had hurt countless others. The officer's lawyer, who had slipped quietly into the room, finally spoke up. Your Honor, with all due respect, my client has a right to due process. You cannot preside over matters in which you are personally involved. Mariah fixed him with a sharp look. And you are correct, counsel. I will not render a final ruling on Officer Grant myself, but I will ensure that his misconduct is documented, his authority stripped for now, and his behavior referred to the State Board for immediate investigation. Due process does not mean delay. It means fairness. And fairness begins today. The lawyer opened his mouth to argue further, but the audience erupted with applause, drowning him out. Mariah allowed the sound to swell for a moment before raising her hand for quiet. Now, she continued, her tone softer but no less commanding, this court will proceed with the remaining docket. But let it be clear, no one in this room will forget what happened here today. Justice is not about silence or submission. It is about courage. It is about truth. And it is about never, ever allowing fear to dictate the outcome. As the next case was called, the atmosphere remained charged. Defendants who had once slouched now sat upright, their eyes glimmering with new hope. Lawyers whispered to each other, calculating the shift in power dynamics. Court staff exchanged glances, their routines disrupted, but their respect for Mariah growing by the minute. Judge Whitaker finally stepped forward, placing a hand gently on the side of the bench. Judge Daniels, he said quietly, though everyone could hear, you've proven today that this courtroom can be more than a place of judgment. It can be a place of redemption, a place of truth. You've done what many of us forgot how to do. Mariah met his eyes, reading the sincerity beneath his gruff exterior. Justice isn't something you sit on, Judge Whitaker. It's something you fight for. And sometimes, she glanced briefly toward the officer, you have to bleed for it first. Her words sent chills through the audience. They weren't just hearing a judge. They were hearing a movement begin. Outside, sirens wailed faintly as media vans began parking along the courthouse steps. The doors would soon open to a storm of cameras and questions. But inside, within these walls, Mariah Daniels had already carved her name into history. What began as a slap, meant to humiliate, her head turned into the spark that ignited something greater. She had taken her seat not as an act of revenge, but as an act of reclamation, reclaiming the dignity stolen from her brother, from herself, and from every person who had been silenced in these halls before her. And though the day was far from over, everyone in that courtroom already knew justice in this city would never look the same again. By the time the court recessed, the world outside had changed. The courthouse steps, usually quiet, except for the shuffle of lawyers and nervous defendants, were swarming with people. Reporters jostled for position, their microphones thrust forward, like weapons of curiosity. Cameras from local and national outlets lined the walkway, their red recording lights blinking like eyes hungry for the story. Protesters had already gathered too, many of them holding hastily made signs scrawled with words like "Justice for All" and "Accountability Now." Inside, Mariah sat in the chambers usually reserved for judges, though she had never expected to occupy them so soon. The room was quiet, but only on the surface. Beneath the stillness, her mind was a storm. She pressed her palms together, inhaled deeply, and exhaled slowly. The sting on her cheek had faded, but the memory of the slap burned sharper than ever. It wasn't pain, it was fuel. There was a knock at the door. It was her brother, Jamal. His eyes still wide with disbelief. He stepped inside, his voice low. "Mariah, I can't believe what just happened. You were sitting there, on the bench, and you—" He trailed off, struggling to find words. Mariah gave him a small smile. "I just did what needed to be done, what should have been done a long time ago." Jamal shook his head. "No, you did more than that. You proved to everybody that we don't have to just take it, that we can stand up and fight. You turned the whole courtroom upside down." She reached out, squeezing his shoulder. "I did it for you, and for everyone like you who walks into those doors thinking the system is stacked against them, because most of the time it is. But today, for once, we tipped the scales back." Before Jamal could respond, another knock sounded. This time it was Judge Whitaker. He stepped inside, his usual stiffness replaced by something more vulnerable. "Daniels," he said, clearing his throat, "you've got a storm out there. Reporters, protesters, community leaders, they're all demanding to see you." Mariah rose from her chair slowly. "Let them—" When she emerged from the courthouse doors, the crowd erupted into cheers, and questions shouted over one another. Cameras flashed in rapid bursts, capturing every angle of her face, every flicker of expression. She raised her hand, and the noise softened just enough for her voice to cut through. "My name is Mariah Daniels," she began, her voice carrying with the strength of someone who had found her purpose. "This morning, I entered this courthouse as an attorney, defending my brother. Within minutes, I was assaulted by an officer of the law, in front of dozens of witnesses. But what that officer didn't know, what none of you knew, is that I am also a judge, appointed to this very bench." The crowd gasped, the weight of her words rippling outward like shockwaves. Reporters scrambled to repeat her words into their microphones. "He tried to silence me with violence," Mariah continued, her voice rising. "But instead, he gave me the microphone to speak louder than ever. Today I sat in the chair meant to deliver justice, and I promise you I will not leave it empty. Not for myself, not for my brother, not for anyone who has been denied their voice." The crowd cheered wildly, their voices echoing against the stone steps of the courthouse. Signs waved higher, chants broke out. "Justice now! Justice now!" One reporter managed to push forward. "Judge Daniels, what will happen to Officer Grant?" Mariah's expression hardened. "Officer Grant will face the consequences of his actions, not only for what he did to me, but for the many lives he may have harmed in his career. His badge is not a shield against accountability. It is supposed to be a symbol of service, and when that trust is broken, it will not be hidden, it will be exposed." The crowd roared again, their energy electric. Another journalist shouted, "What does this mean for the justice system here? Do you believe it's broken?" Mariah paused, then spoke carefully. "The system is not broken, it is working exactly as it was designed to, and that is the problem. It was built to protect power, not people. But we can change that. Piece by piece, case by case, truth by truth. Today was just one moment, but let it be the first of many." Her words ignited the crowd. People who had come angry now left inspired, their voices lifted in chants that carried down the block and into the city. The footage of her speech would be replayed across news stations nationwide within the hour, sparking conversations far beyond the courthouse. Meanwhile, inside the building, Officer Grant sat in a holding room, his world crumbling, his phone buzzed relentlessly with messages from colleagues, supervisors, even family members, but he couldn't bring himself to answer. On social media, his name was already trending for all the wrong reasons. Clips of him slapping Mariah replayed endlessly, each one accompanied by captions condemning his actions. "This isn't how it was supposed to go," he muttered to himself, his hands trembling. For years he had gotten away with bending the truth, intimidating defendants, throwing his weight around. But in one careless moment, he had exposed himself not just as a bully, but as a symbol of everything people despised about the system. Back outside, Mariah stood tall, her brother beside her, Judge Whitaker at her back, and the people in front of her. For the first time in her career, she felt the full weight of her calling, not just to interpret the law, but to reshape it. The slap meant to silence her had become the sound that woke an entire city, and the echoes of it were only just beginning to spread. The videos had gone viral before sunset, clips of the slap, the shocked gasps of the courtroom, and then the breathtaking moment when Mariah Daniels walked up and took the judge's bench were playing on every news station in the country. Social media turned it into a symbol, a rallying cry. Hashtags like #SlapOfJustice and #Judge Daniels climbed to the top of trending lists within hours. Some clips had already been viewed millions of times. Commentators debated it on evening broadcasts. Civil rights leaders praised her courage. Community organizers called for reforms, pointing to her story as proof of systemic abuse. And perhaps most striking of all, ordinary people who had long felt ignored shared their own stories in the comments sections, stories of mistreatment, dismissal, humiliation. Mariah's defiance had opened a floodgate in the police department. The fallout was brutal. Officer Grant was placed not only on suspension but under internal investigation. His record was combed through, and quickly, disturbing patterns emerged. Complaints he had once brushed off as lies resurfaced, now viewed in a new light. Cases that had rested on his testimony alone were reopened. Defense attorneys lined up to appeal convictions tied to his name. Grant's former colleagues distanced themselves, some whispering that he had always been reckless, others admitting quietly that they feared he'd finally exposed the department's worst-kept secrets. Grant himself spiraled. For years he had lived on arrogance, convinced his uniform gave him untouchable power. Now, stripped of it, he felt like a naked man on a stage. His face was plastered across headlines with words like disgrace and shame. He tried to protest his innocence in a recorded statement, claiming he'd been provoked, but the video evidence made him a liar in real time. His fall was swift, public, and irreversible. Meanwhile, Mariah found herself thrust into the spotlight in a way she had never anticipated. When she returned home that night, exhausted but unbroken, she was greeted by a crowd outside her apartment building, neighbors cheering and holding candles. Some called her name, others simply shouted, "Thank you." She waved humbly, her brother by her side, the weight of their shared struggle written on their faces. The following week, the official swearing-in ceremony for her judgeship took place. What was meant to be a quiet, procedural event became a spectacle. Hundreds gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs of support. The governor himself attended, standing at her side as she raised her right hand and took the oath. Cameras clicked furiously, recording the moment a black woman who had once been dismissed as just another voice in the crowd became the voice of the law itself. As she slid into the robe for the first time, applause filled the chamber. She touched the fabric gently, feeling both the weight of its history and the power of its future. When she sat in the judge's seat officially this time, it was not in protest, not in defiance, but in rightful authority. She addressed the audience. After the ceremony, "This robe does not erase what happened. It does not erase the slap. It does not erase the years of injustice that led us here. But it does symbolize something, that no matter how many times they try to silence us, we will rise louder. We will rise stronger, and we will rise higher." Her words sent chills through the crowd. People clapped, cried, embraced. Jamal stood in the front row, tears streaking his cheeks, pride radiating from his face. For him, this was more than a victory. It was proof that the system that nearly crushed him could be bent, reshaped, forced to answer to truth. National outlets picked up her speech. Within days, Mariah Daniels wasn't just a local name. She was a national figure. Invitations poured in from universities, asking her to lecture. From activists wanting her voice at rallies. From media networks hoping for interviews. She accepted. Some declined others, but always returned to the bench, because she knew the real work was here, case by case, moment by moment, where people walked in hoping for fairness. Her first weeks were challenging. Every ruling she made was scrutinized, every word dissected. Some critics accused her of bias, claiming she would always rule against police. Others accused her of being too cautious, but none could deny her impact. Her courtroom became known as a place where evidence mattered more than reputation, where defendants were treated with humanity, where officers were held to the same standard as civilians. As for Officer Grant, his life unraveled further. Formal charges were filed against him for assaulting Mariah, and investigations revealed he had fabricated evidence in at least 3 cases. He faced trial of his own, his career destroyed, his name forever linked not to power but to disgrace. The irony was bitter. The man who once believed he could silence others with a slap had been silenced by the truth, and through it all, Mariah kept her focus. Every morning she entered her courtroom, she remembered the sting on her cheek, not as a wound, but as a scar of honor. A reminder that justice isn't given, it's taken, seized, demanded. The courthouse had changed, the city had changed, and, perhaps, in small ways, the country had begun to change too, because on that one morning, in that one courtroom, power tried to humiliate her with violence, and instead, it handed her the gavel. Months passed, but the memory of that slap never faded. It became a story people told their children, a moment replayed in classrooms, on talk shows, in church sermons. It wasn't about the humiliation anymore, it was about what came after, about the strength of a woman who refused to bow her head, who turned her pain into power. Mariah Daniels settled into her role as judge with the kind of quiet fire that unsettled the old guard. She didn't need theatrics. Her presence alone shifted the air in the room. Defendants who once feared they'd be steamrolled by the system now found themselves given a chance to speak. Families who had felt invisible suddenly felt seen. Even prosecutors began to adjust, knowing that half-baked arguments and unchecked assumptions would no longer pass unchallenged in her court. Her courtroom became known across the state. People drove hours to witness her hearings, not because they expected drama, but because they wanted to see justice feel real. For too long, courtrooms had been places where power decided outcomes before words were even spoken. But under Judge Daniels, every word counted. Every life counted. The community responded in kind. Crime didn't disappear, but the relationship between the people and the system began to shift. For the first time, residents believed change was possible not because laws had magically rewritten themselves, but because someone on the inside refused to forget what it felt like to be on the outside. Nationally, her influence spread too. She was invited to speak before Congress, her testimony shaking the chamber with both its clarity and its courage. She stood at universities, addressing young law students, urging them to remember that justice without compassion was no justice at all. She worked with advocacy groups, helping design reforms that targeted systemic abuses like falsified police reports, coerced confessions, and racial profiling. Meanwhile, Officer Grant's trial became a spectacle of its own. The same cameras that once captured his smug confidence now recorded his downfall. He sat at the defense table, stripped of his uniform, his eyes downcast as witnesses testified to his pattern of abuse. When the verdict came guilty on multiple counts, the cheers outside the courthouse shook the city blocks. It wasn't just about punishing him. It was about proving accountability was possible. For Mariah, though, the victory was bittersweet. She never celebrated his downfall. She only acknowledged it as necessary. Justice isn't about revenge, she told reporters. It's about restoring balance. And balance means everyone is held to the same standard. Years later, people still talked about that day. The footage of the slap and her calm defiance had become iconic, used in documentaries, studied in law schools, even painted as murals in neighborhoods where hope once felt scarce. Children who saw her on TV grew up wanting to be lawyers, judges, advocates wanting to stand where she had stood. And Mariah, she never stopped carrying the memory with her. Every morning, as she slipped into her robe and sat at the bench, she ran her fingers lightly across her cheek, the ghost of that sting forever etched in her skin. It wasn't a scar. It wasn't pain. It was a reminder. A reminder that one act meant to silence her had instead amplified her voice to the world. In the end, her story wasn't about the slap at all. It was about what she did next. About how she turned humiliation into history, violence into victory, silence into a seat at the highest table of justice. And as she looked out from the bench each day, gavel in hand, she knew one truth that carried her through. The sound of that slap may have started the story, but the echo of her risen, unshakable, undeniable, unstoppable, would never fade.